Point Live. We're coming to you from Dixie State University's campus in the CEC building in the kitchen. And I'm Jennifer Kohler, and this is my partner in crime.
I'm Eric Young. Glad to have you with us this morning, Wednesday morning at 9:30.
Yeah.
I decided to become a little less formal without a tie and jacket.
Oh, I know. I like your more laid-back look. Yeah, you don't look so like a stuffy teacher.
I watched the show, last week's show, and I thought, oh, who is that guy? On a number of levels. So this might mean that next week I might show up in just like a t-shirt and a bathrobe.
Yeah,
who knows?
yeah.
You know, the kitchen
That's
setting.
Right. That's right. Okay.
We probably
sure, pajama day, right?
Yeah. Why
yes.
not? We could shoot at 2 o'clock in the morning while I'm making a turkey sandwich, kind of thing.
Well, we both have a lot on our minds right now.
There's a lot to be thinking about.
Yes, a lot on our plates, as it were, with school and our families and everything going on, and the government and all the stuff we have to pay attention to. Yeah, so we were going to talk about a bunch of stuff today. We were going to talk about the women's movement, and mix that up with throw in a little compassion, and talk a little bit about maybe even the 5 moral roots of liberals and conservatives. Just stir it around and make a big stew out of it.
If you want to join the conversation, you can do so on our Facebook page. It's at facebook.com/talkingpointlive. So if you go there, I'm guessing maybe you're watching us on the CEC channel, channel 22, or on our YouTube channel through the CEC as well. So I'm monitoring our Talking Point Live page right here. And if you want to join us, please feel free to chime in, and I'll read your comments on the air as long as I can, and include that into our conversation.
Great.
So,
Great.
So I was telling you before the show about a conversation I had with my social media class yesterday. Is that how you want to kick this off?
Yeah, I do. Because you posed the question, basically, you look back at various social movements, the civil rights movement, and then various other points in history, and then up to the women's movement, and you posed the question to your class, why is the women's equality movement not
just women's equality movement.
Okay.
Really, so we looked at the success of the civil rights movement, certainly with Martin Luther King Jr. And the efforts that were espoused to go through and get people to attend and to light them up in terms of what the movement was all about. And the only technology they really had at the time was a mimeograph machine. Printed out 56,000 handouts, flyers, to go through and mobilize.
And you're talking about the Washington Mall when Martin Luther King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech, and it was also not only civil rights, but it was about work and economic issues specifically, right?
Certainly, yeah. There's a lot encompassed in the whole movement. So.
And what year was that? 65.
65.
65, I want
to
say.
64, but...
All right, mid-60s. Okay, we're in the Washington Mall.
So, anyway, we have then, many years later, we have the World Wide Web comes along, and then we have this ability to start mobilizing individuals using social media. And the Arab Spring is probably the closest iteration we have of that mobilization. We had a Google executive who used Google and Facebook to go through and start organizing individuals in terms of a protest in Cairo. And that became what we now know as the Arab Spring. And then we had movements happening in Turkey. We had Iran's mock or failed elections of 2011 that all ended up in this huge uprisal of citizens being, showing their discontent in terms of the idea of democracy that was, being expressed at the time. The problem with each one of these protests is that years later, now we're 6 years down the road from all of those, from Turkey, from Cairo, and Iran, and nothing's changed.
In those countries, you're saying?
Right. It's we're still there, and some might argue we're still there in terms of the civil rights movement as well.
Right.
Very little has changed along that line. However, we do have a constitutionally, an amended constitutional idea of civil rights, at least into law, that we didn't have before. We don't have that in terms of what's going on currently in terms of the Women's March. Anyway, so that's background to the whole point that I'm trying to make here. So I posed my question to my class, and this is a class that studies social media, granted, okay? So the idea was, well, social media has all this power to go through and reach millions instantaneously, to be able to put up a message and to organize and to get people at a certain location. Why doesn't it stick? You know, why don't we have that committed follow-through that we did see in terms of the civil rights movement? What's missing there? So I posed that out to the class, and a number of hands went up, and one hand in particular went up and said, well, it might be because the reason why women aren't equal or aren't considered equal is because that's the natural order of things. And I kind of resisted the whole natural idea of that, because to me the natural idea is that we are all equal. And she went on to go through and say, because of a cultural or religious influence in terms of Old Testament ideas and certainly New Testament ideas, that women are subjugated to men and men are subjugated to God that way. That there's this kind of thing. And it struck me for the first time. I thought, there must be, obviously there's a substantial amount of women who believe that.
Well, you just said the key word, believe, because when you were talking earlier about social media being able to spread ideas bump up against beliefs, right?
Sure.
And so I think that's the simple answer. If there's a simple answer to your question, why haven't things changed more? Because information doesn't necessarily change a belief system.
Right.
And so when there's strongly held beliefs, they tend to maintain the status quo. And so you can get a lot of information coming, social media or any other way, and it's not necessarily going to change the beliefs.
No, I understand
right?
that.
So,
well, the civil rights movement, the belief was pretty easy to go through and adhere to if you were an African American or sympathetic to the plight of the lack of rights for African Americans at the time, right? I don't think you could have found an African American citizen of the United States at the time who didn't fully back up the concept of equal rights.
Right, and then there's certain segment of the white South that would not be behind it, right?
Of course.
Right.
Right, just based on a racial segregation. But with the women's movement, it's not that defined. So here we have, and it's not even a majority. It's hard for me to go through and put that into kind of calculable terms. But you have a group of women who are protesting nationwide. It was the biggest turnout of any type of movement in the history of this country this last weekend.
Describe that event a little bit for people who might not be tuned into it. Like, what happened?
Throughout urban centers in the country, women turned out to go through and not just protest, but to educate on the importance of their vote.
Okay.
To get out and vote.
Okay.
And even though we're a year away from any type of interim election, or 3 years away from getting into another presidential type of into that candidacy, the pressure is on, the push is on to go through and make sure that women's voices are heard.
Okay.
In that respect, so that's my point, and I think I've yet to make in getting back to this is the reason why we're still struggling with the concept of equal gender. Does that boil down to the notion that not all women are behind that cause to begin with, as much as all minorities or African Americans were behind the concept of civil rights?
Well, okay, my response to that is I always want to know what somebody means by the word equal. Like, I think that can be interpreted on so many different levels. For example, there's equal pay for equal work. That's pretty straightforward description of what that means in that sense of equality. There might be terms of equal before the law when it comes to civil rights, the right to vote, the right to own property, et cetera, et cetera. So there's another type of equal. When it comes to equal in terms of physical strength, you might find a general discrepancy that men tend to be, there tends to be an inequality there. That men tend to be. I think
that's an old stereotype anymore.
Well, I don't want to arm wrestle you, and I'm in pretty good shape, but I have a feeling that you would cream me at arm wrestling. And I'm in pretty good shape, so I'm just saying, you're probably physically, you could probably lift more weight than me, you could probably cream me, even at thumbsies, you might cream me. So I think I would posit that physically men tend to be. Now, women, I understand, have more fat in their bodies, and they might be able.
What if you were
just a
5'11",
minute.
240 pounds, you worked out
Yeah,
as a woman?
right. So in that case, I might be quite a bit stronger than a lot of men.
Right.
Right. So I'm just talking generally speaking.
That's the problem with that.
Okay,
Is the
okay.
generality of that equality is based on physical ability.
Okay. Now, as far as
We're
intelligence
we're
goes, I
technically
think
advanced
women are.
enough to where we don't have to depend on physical strength
right, we
to
don't-
go through and accomplish something that improves our living situation.
Exactly.
Ameliorates human beings.
And I'm just saying that when we say equal, I like a little bit more description about what we mean by and what context we mean equal.
Equal here and equal here.
Yes. Well, I think women are often more compassionate than men.
Well, I agree with you there. But it's not that men don't
And I
have
think
the
women
ability to be
are-
compassionate.
Right. I didn't say that, but I'm just saying maybe it's a cultural thing too. Like from one culture to another, you might find people demonstrating skills and abilities based on gender just because of the culture they grow up in.
Yeah, but again, that becomes somewhat of a cultural stereotype.
Yeah.
Now, I was telling you about Helen Fisher. She's an anthropologist. She studied why people fall in love the way they do and what gender roles kind of emerge out of relationships in that respect. And she goes back thousands of years, pre-civilization in terms of how we go through and define it. And she indicates that before we got into the plow, before we got into any kind of mechanized approaches to creating food, men and women were I'm inventing new words here on the show today, were equally responsible for bringing home the evening meal.
So who is minding the babies?
Maybe the babies were strapped on to the father or the mother while they're out doing what it is that they're doing. See, it's that kind of thinking. Well, who was at home taking care of the kids?
Right. Because I would think that.
Maybe the kids were out on the Serengeti walking along with their parents and being taught how to go through and hunt and forage for the evening meal.
Well, we've seen plenty of babies strapped to typically mothers when mothers are at work outside doing labor. So I guess maybe we weren't hanging out in the cave.
Until men start lactating, they're probably going to still be strapped to mothers.
Right. Right.
So obviously there's physical differences there, but I'm trying to dismiss the whole physicality away from this idea of equality.
Okay.
Because it's what stood in the way of reaching the concept of equality between gender.
Okay. So you're saying we should not mind, be bogged down by the physical.
And we need to get away from that.
Okay.
And I'm kind of stunned that we're still even grappling within that at a time when we're post-industrial, we're post-technology, for crying out loud at this point. Why do we still come back to those concepts? My daughter is in the Army, and she goes through physical training and physical testing as a result. And she's maxed out the female standard for the United States Army. She scores perfectly every time. And she's begging them, let me do the male standard. And they won't.
That's interesting.
I'm fascinated by that. And I know darn well why they won't. It's because she's going to kick their ass. Can I say ass on? Is that
on cable TV?
Is that on cable
I think
TV?
you just
Oh,
did
yeah.
a couple
Okay.
of times.
All right. So my point being, if we can move the physicality away and look at, and I'm not going to sit here and say that we are exactly alike in terms of gender, because we're not. You bring a holistic, global point of view as a woman, and I bring a more pointed, boxed point of view. I go from subject to subject, and you're able to make relationships. And again, I'm stereotyping here, but brain research goes through and shows that we think differently. We're not alike in that respect.
Okay, so we're equal but not identical.
Oh, hell no.
Right? I mean, everyone is.
no.
And don't you think some people, though, when they hear the word equal, they think it means identical, and they think in their mind we're talking the same, and we're not saying the same. And that's why I like discussing what the word equal means, because it doesn't mean identical or the same. And a lot of people, I think, take it that way.
Maybe equal in ability and output,
Yeah.
in effect, in ameliorating, in loving, in being compassionate, in being relational. there are two different approaches that are complementary to each other, thank goodness, because as parents, we have to have that complement in order to go through perhaps and instill that within our progeny. And that's not to say that single parents don't have that ability, because I believe they do. And that's not to say that same-sex parents don't have that ability, because often in same-sex relationships, we still have a masculine-feminine approach to parenting that's going on there.
Okay. So back to your question then that you started with your class. Why hasn't the women's movement been successful, is the way you said it, or made more progress? I'm not sure how you phrased it, but so do you feel like you have an answer to that question?
Well, I think you answered it pretty easily at the beginning of the show when you said it's this rub between belief and attitude, or belief in moray, or belief in tradition.
Really struck by how powerful beliefs are in the face of information. Are you not? I was just listening the other day on one of our favorite shows.
The whole reason why we don't have civil discourse online.
Right. I was listening on the media that interview that Brooke Gladstone did with Leslie Gelb, who was hired by Robert McNamara to assemble a report on the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And they were given originally, he and his team, I think 2 months to do their report. And this would have been in about 65. And he was saying, basically the gist of his argument is that first of all, a lot of people that write about the Pentagon Papers have never even bothered to interview him and don't have any idea how they were generated to begin with, the purpose of them, etc. And he said that overarching thing he feels is being misrepresented in the media is that, yes, there are lies. And the Pentagon Papers are a series of reports and documents describing the history of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. Yes, there are examples of government leaders lying to the American public. They're in there, the lies. But he said the overarching thing that should be acknowledged, which is not being acknowledged in his mind, is that you will see if you read those papers that the leaders of the United States and maybe some other countries had a belief system. And their belief system was firmly entrenched in the domino theory. And because they were inside of that box, when they got information, it bumped up against their belief system of the domino theory. And they could not make rational, effective decisions based on information that said, for a lot of reasons, you're not going to win this war. They were trapped by their belief system.
So define a domino theory for me.
Okay.
For me, the overarching belief system was this idea of democracy and trying to impress that on a nation that wasn't ready to receive.
Well, and the domino theory, and I remember my dad explicitly stating this to me, and this is when we lived in Buffalo, New York. I probably was in 8th or 9th grade, which would have been about 1967, 68, right in there. And he said to me, if we don't win in Vietnam, if Vietnam falls to the communists, then the rest of Southeast Asia will fall to communism.
Right.
And we cannot let that happen.
We call that a slippery slope.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. But I think it was referred to a lot as the domino theory, okay?
Right.
I'm a little older than you, so I was probably talking about the domino theory when you were like in preschool.
I was 5.
Yeah.
In 1967.
Okay, and I was more like 14-ish, 13, 14-ish, 12-ish, I don't know how. Well, anyway, 11-ish in 65. But the point being that because these leaders were trapped in this belief system, they couldn't take the new information and make good decisions with it. And I think that's fascinating.
So you're making a parallel to that, to the women's movement?
I'm just saying, again, we are confronted. And the woman in your class who was telling you that the reason women are in the place they are in society is because the Bible says so or God says so, that's a belief system then that she is using to filter. It's really filtering information through the belief system. And so I think that's what we're up against, if you will.
So is that something to overcome, or is that something that we just accept in terms of the sensitivity that we have to the overall idea of belief and kind of take our licks in terms of not reaching any kind of constitutionally amended more rights for women in that respect. Or some would even argue that that's not needed because they're protected just under the provisions of the Constitution as it is.
Okay, let's look at, if we take it away from equal rights for women, and also you could say Black Lives Matter, where you're singling out a part of the population that's been oppressed.
Okay.
And it's a legitimate focus, in my opinion. This population, they have been oppressed and abused.
Yes.
Okay, that's legitimate. But if you take it over to all lives matter and all humans should have equal rights, you know, you've switched it off the oppressed populations to a more general category, for example, and then you just look at individual people and you say, you deserve as a human being, I don't care what your gender or your race or your class is, you deserve as a human being to be equally represented before the law, to be respected, okay, to have certain inalienable rights. If you put it there, I think you get farther.
You think that's enough?
I think it
But it hasn't.
could be enough.
But it hasn't been enough.
No, it hasn't. And so
These ideas are to be self-evident, have not been self-evident.
I know, and they weren't when
Life,
they
liberty, and
weren't
the
when they
pursuit of
wrote them in
happiness.
the first place. There was like these categories and exceptions, even when the
Sure.
Declaration of
Right.
Independence
In
and the
terms of
Constitution
being
were
white
framed.
landowners versus
right. We'll let
slaves.
the next generation deal with this
Right.
problem, right? So, but anyway, that's where I always want to go with the conversation.
Well,
I always
that's why
want
I'm
to go
saying
to
obviously
individuals.
that hasn't been enough because we still have
But
women's
maybe
lives matter.
But maybe it hasn't been enough because we really haven't done that seriously. We really have not looked at individuals as, you know, from one individual to another. We have not seriously looked at that.
We can't because that's the antithesis to conservatism.
Oh, now.
Is to go back to the individual and say, what do you need? And
Well, okay, I think I see where you're going. Conservatism being more oriented towards the group. And
no, conservatism being more oriented, and I support this, by the way. I'm kind of a fiscal conservative. Conservatism being less government, period. Less government
I
involvement
don't
in that.
agree. You're talking about.
What do you mean? That's the foundation of the
You're
GOP.
talking GOP. So I was going to say you're talking about American political conservatism.
Yes.
I'm talking about conservatism.
You're talking about social conservatism.
I'm talking about the wide range of conservatism. Okay, so you mean U.S. political conservatism. Okay, got it. So now you're saying, what were we saying about that?
You lost me now.
Okay.
You were getting, okay, so you're saying, well, instead of focusing on groups, we need to go more to the individual.
We need to take the individual seriously and the individual rights seriously. And that way, if we take that seriously, everybody gets it. Everybody does. Everybody's included.
How do you do that?
Well, you have to take it seriously, so...
Do we have a political... Can I have my own political action committee as a result of being an individual? Can I have my own lobbyists in Washington lobbying for my specific interests alone?
Well,
Or do I go out and try to make a difference on my own as a human being and show compassion and service and regardless of what anybody else around me is doing?
right. Well, I think you for sure do part two, you on your own.
What are you promoting here with the individualist idea?
That I'm just saying that if we had our attitudes and our laws regulated towards protecting everybody as an individual, we wouldn't have all these separate categories. And I think these separate categories come from our instinct as humans to have tribes and groups.
Well, like I've been saying though, that the whole intent of the preamble is to go through and say, you know, everybody has this. The individual is recognized in terms of their ability, their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. But it hasn't worked.
No, it hasn't, because we haven't taken it literally and seriously. We haven't had integrity about what it means. We've just fallen back to old cultural habits and attitudes.
Can you imagine the uproar that would exist if there was a Women's Lives Matter movement? I mean, go back to the 60s with Gloria Steinem and the whole feminist movement and what men did to that in terms of, well, it's anti-male then, if that's the case. Just like we did with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter must be anti-white then as a result of that. It becomes more divisive then it becomes hopefully serving for that particular group of people.
That's because you're focusing on a population, you're
Yeah,
creating
to
a
me,
tribe.
it's more of a paradigm shift in terms of our own internal values, going back to the individual and seeing them as not a part of a specific group or tribe.
Well, you
or
can be
race
part
or
of
religion
we're part of many groups, right?
Right.
I mean, and that's just a fact of life. They intersect with one another. So I'm talking about the laws of a country and the traditions and the institutions of a country honoring everybody as equal from an institutional point of view, right? And then from a legal point of view, these equal rights, no distinctions, which we have on the books. That's on the books. We just haven't honored it. And then as individuals, again, resisting the urge to create a tribe that has to be divisive with another. Like sports, for example, you know, I have my issues with sports, and I love that athletics and teams can provide opportunities for people to learn discipline and teamwork and cooperation and all those good traits and loyalty. But I don't like the tribal nonsense that comes with those kinds of things.
That's
that
what
creates
it capitalizes on.
I know,
That's
it
how
does.
they make their money.
I know, it's a lot of nonsense, and it's a lot of, especially when people get silly about not liking people or getting crazy over if their team wins or doesn't win, or their tribe looks bad or not bad, you know. Anyway, but I
Spoken
digress.
like a true Patriots fan.
I digress. Well, Tom Brady, I mean, come on. Whatever team he's on, I'm kind of going to be partial to. Although I haven't seen any games. I haven't had time to watch television, so I don't even know. I think did they even win the other weekend?
You're asking the wrong guy, because I
Well,
feel pretty much
okay.
the same way about the NFL as
Yes,
you do in that
yeah.
respect.
So-
now, for the NHL, we could be talking about something, but
Well, so we're down to our last 4 minutes.
right. Did we get anywhere with this show today?
Well,
Did we get anywhere?
we raised some questions.
I have a few people. Hi, Jackie.
Yeah.
It's nice to see you. I appreciate your going through and listening to the show, at least liking us here that way. But I don't have any other questions coming in
Okay.
on that. I'm still pretty entrenched and surprised by the idea that if all women don't take the idea of equality seriously, then those who do will be handicapped by that.
You're saying if all women don't sign on, we won't get where we need to get?
Right.
Well,
At least that's what I'm coming from in terms of social media's influence with the movement. How it goes through and it has a tendency to adopt the fringe and put it out there and say, you know, look at these protesters and see what they're doing, while perhaps the quiet majority are sitting at home saying, I don't think I want that.
well, it could be a phenomenon that exists. I'm not really sure. And I'd be curious on that student who had that attitude, if it came,
And she wasn't alone.
but if it came down to a list of specifics, do you think women should have the equal opportunity to vote with men? Do you think women should be paid the same amount per hour for the same job as a man? Do you think a woman should have the right to drive a car the same as a man? Do you think a woman should have, you know, if you went down a list of equality questions, it would be really interesting to see what that student would say.
I think she would
Because
agree with every single one of them.
I don't know that she's thinking in terms of equal the same way you are.
Right. Oh, okay. I'll concede that. I
Yeah.
see what you're saying that way.
So to me,
I
there's
think
a
the
little.
question should be, do you think a woman is as equally capable at making contributions to society as a man is?
Well, maybe more so. I have a tendency to think the one who raises the children or has the primary influence on children has a huge power over society.
I agree with
So there again, you know, I think we're it's safer territory if we get a little more specific about, you know.
Yeah, and I'm going the other way, that we need to be a
You
little
are.
more general about
Yeah, and
the efficacy
you
of the
probably
gender.
need both, but
gotta have both.
go the specific and the general.
Okay. Well, another show.
We didn't talk about compassion
We'll
yet.
get into compassion next week.
And
I
we
have a
didn't
few
talk
things to
about
say
the moral
that.
roots of liberals and conservatives
Yeah,
yet,
thank
which
goodness.
I love.
We'll come back to that next week. Thank you for spending a half hour with us this morning. I was going to make some omelets today, but decided not to. Maybe we'll make some breakfast next week. And,
Okay, I would love that.
crowd around the table and talk
Okay.
that way. If you got more to say to follow up with the show, please join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/TalkingPointLive. And for Talking Point, here from Dixie State University, my name is Eric Young.
I'm Jennifer Kohler.
See you next week. Thanks for joining us.